A new blood rule specifically for FEI show jumping was supposed to create a clearer and more consistent system for protecting horses. But during the first 20 weeks of 2026, officials issued 186 jumping recorded warnings involving blood on horses. That works out to more than 9 warnings every week. For comparison, 116 show jumping riders were eliminated for blood on their horses' flanks during all of 2025. In 2024, there were 83 such eliminations. So why did the number of recorded blood cases rise so dramatically after the FEI changed its show jumping rules? Are more horses actually bleeding? Are officials now documenting cases that might previously have gone unrecorded? Or has replacing immediate elimination with a warning made the consequences feel less serious? Before we get into those questions, we need to make one important distinction. This is not a universal blood rule applying to every FEI equestrian discipline. The warning system we are discussing today is Article 259 of the 2026 FEI Jumping Rules. It applies specifically to international show jumping competitions governed by the FEI. Under Article 259, blood caused by tack or equipment or otherwise induced by the athlete results in a jumping recorded warning for the person responsible. The rule applies during the competition period, beginning with the warm-up and continuing through the competition of any post-competition controls or testing. Blood could potentially be discovered in the horse's mouth, on its flanks, or elsewhere on its body. However, officials must consider the source of that blood. Article 259 specifically addresses blood determined to have been caused by the athlete, tack, or equipment. This distinction matters because not every instance of blood is necessarily caused by a rider. A horse might accidentally bite its lip or tongue, experience a nosebleed, scratch itself, reopen an existing wound, or sustain an unrelated minor injury. When blood is discovered, the FEI's protocol requires officials to examine the horse and consider what caused it. The ground jury must consult with veterinary delegates to assess whether the horse is fit to compete in that competition or in additional competitions at the event. If the blood is determined to be athlete-induced or caused by tack or equipment, the person responsible receives a jumping recorded warning. But unlike the previous rule covering blood on the flanks, the rider is not automatically eliminated solely because of that blood finding. That is the controversial part. Under the older show jumping rules, blood found on a horse's flank generally resulted in elimination. Under the 2026 system, the immediate regulatory consequences is normally a recorded warning combined with a mandatory assessment of the horse. A first jumping recorded warning does not produce an automatic suspension. If the same person receives 2 or more jumping recorded warnings within 12 months of the first warning, that person receives a fine of 1,000 Swiss francs and an automatic 1-month suspension. This means a rider must generally accumulate a second warning within that 12-month period before facing the automatic suspension and fine established by Article 259. More serious circumstances can still be addressed. Under separate FEI provisions, Article 259 does not eliminate the rules covering excessive spur marks, inappropriate use of the whip, or abuse of a horse. Depending on what officials find, those separate provisions may result in elimination or more serious sanctions. Still, the basic fact remains. Blood determined to have been caused by the athlete, tack, or equipment no longer automatically ends a show jumping rider's competition under Article 259. According to a May 2026 investigation published by horsesport.com, 186 jumping recorded warnings were issued during the first 20 weeks of the year. That is an average of approximately 9.3 warnings per week. During all of 2025, 116 show jumping riders were reportedly eliminated for blood on their horses' flanks. That averaged approximately 2.2 cases per week. In 2024, there were 83 such eliminations, averaging approximately 1.6 per week. At first glance, this appears to be an enormous increase. The early 2026 rate of recorded warnings was more than 4 times the weekly rate of flank blood eliminations reported in 2025. However, these numbers are not a direct like-for-like comparison. The older figures primarily counted riders eliminated after blood was found on a horse's flanks. The new rule covers a wider range of athlete-induced or equipment-related blood findings, including blood in the mouth. Before 2026, FEI show jumping officials had more discretion in cases involving blood in the mouth. A horse that appeared to have accidentally bitten its lip or tongue was not necessarily eliminated. Because Article 259 covers more possible locations and creates a formal record, the increase does not automatically prove that riders are causing horses to bleed more frequently. It may mean that officials are identifying and recording cases that were not included in the older elimination figures. The new warning system may also make officials more comfortable taking action. Under the old system, an official dealing with a borderline case knew that the decision could eliminate a rider immediately. At a major championship, that decision could also destroy an entire team's result. A recorded warning may feel easier to issue because it does not necessarily end the rider's competition. If officials are more willing to document questionable cases, that could explain part of the increase. But there is another possibility that cannot simply be dismissed. Replacing immediate elimination with a warning may have reduced the rule's deterrent effect. If riders know that a first athlete-induced blood finding will normally produce a recorded warning rather than elimination, does that reduce the incentive to be exceptionally careful about the use of bits, spurs, and other equipment? We cannot answer that question from the total number of warnings alone. We need more detailed information about each case, including where the blood was found, what caused it, whether the horse was allowed to continue, and whether the rider had previously received a warning. The FEI initially cautioned against drawing conclusions from the early numbers. When Horsesport.com contacted the organization in February 2026, after 47 warnings had already been issued, an FEI spokesperson said the sample size was still too small to establish a trend and confirmed that the FEI was monitoring the data. By the time the publication followed up again in May, the number had risen to 186. According to the article, the FEI did not respond to that second request for comment. Although 186 cases represents a very small percentage of the nearly 500,000 FEI show jumping starts reportedly taking place each year, percentages do not tell the entire welfare story. Each recorded warning represents a horse on which officials found blood that they believe was caused by the athlete, tack, or equipment. Calling the percentage small does not make those individual cases unimportant. The first automatic suspension under the new system reportedly occurred only days after Article 259 took effect. Egyptian rider Ismail Osama Bori received 2 jumping recorded warnings with the same horse during the Doha CSI 5-star competition. Because he received 2 warnings, the repeat offense provision was triggered, resulting in the automatic 1-month suspension and 1,000 Swiss franc fine. Later, Venezuelan rider Luis Fernando repeatedly received 2 jumping recorded warnings, approximately 1 week apart, at competitions in Lexington. These cases demonstrate one potential benefit of the system. The FEI now has a public record that can identify patterns involving the same person across multiple classes, horses, or competition venues. Under the previous system, a rider might be eliminated from one class, but the rule was not necessarily structured to create the same escalating consequences if another incident occurred months later. Supporters of Article 259 argue that recording every qualifying incident requiring a veterinary assessment and penalizing repeat cases may create more meaningful long-term accountability. Critics ask a different question. Why should a second horse or a second blood incident be required before the rider receives a suspension? If officials determine that blood was caused by the athlete or equipment, should that rider be permitted to continue in the same competition? Is a warning an adequate consequence for the first events? Could the system unintentionally suggest that the first instance of blood is acceptable as long as it's not repeated within 12 months? The controversy surrounding Article 259 grew partly from what happened at the 2024 Paris Olympics. Brazilian show jumper Pedro Vinícius was eliminated after officials discovered a small lesion on the flank of his horse. The finding was described as a microlesion, but under the rules in effect at the time, it resulted in elimination. Because Olympic show jumping teams no longer have a drop score, the elimination also removed Brazil from the team competition. That created an enormous sporting consequence from what supporters of the rule change considered a very minor mark. Jumping stakeholders pushed for a more proportionate system that would distinguish between a small, isolated lesion and a severe or repeated welfare violation. There is a legitimate discussion to be had about proportionality. A tiny spot of blood and a serious injury are not medically identical. Officials should examine the horse, establish the probable cause, assess its condition, and document what happened. But proportionality does not necessarily require allowing the competition result to stand. Eliminating a competition from a class does not automatically mean the rider intentionally abused the horse. Elimination can simply establish a firm, competitive boundary. If the horse is bleeding because of the athlete, tack, or equipment, that performance cannot continue or count. The rider's intention is not the only consideration. The outcome for the horse matters too. Horses cannot choose their bits, bridles, spurs, or riders. They cannot withdraw themselves when pressure becomes excessive. They depend on riders, trainers, veterinarians, stewards, judges, and governing organizations to recognize when something has gone wrong. Personally, I believe athlete-induced blood should result in elimination from that competition, even when the injury appears relatively minor. That elimination could be combined with the positive parts of Article 259, including a mandatory veterinary assessment, a permanent recorded warning, and escalating sanctions for repeat cases. That would create both an immediate competitive consequence and a long-term record. It is also important not to describe Article 259 as the single FEI blood rule, because other disciplines handle blood differently. Under the 2026 FEI dressage rules, confirmed fresh blood on the horse within the competition arena space results in elimination. Dressage does not use the show jumping Article 259 system. Eventing has its own provisions under Article 525 of the FEI eventing rules, including discipline-specific consequences and eventing recorded warnings. Although an eventing competition includes dressage and jumping phases, that does not mean Article 259 automatically governs every blood finding during an event. The FEI therefore continues to have different blood policies across different disciplines. That lack of consistency creates another major concern. If blood caused by a rider or equipment is considered incompatible with continuing a dressage test, why can the regulatory outcome be different in show jumping? The horse's skin and mouth do not become less sensitive simply because it is jumping fences instead of performing a dressage test. If the FEI believes a recorded warning and veterinary assessment are the best response, it should clearly explain why that standard provides adequate protection in show jumping. If it believes confirmed blood requirements elimination in dressage, it should explain why the same principle does not necessarily apply across all disciplines. The 186 warnings reported during the 21st weeks of 2026 do not prove that Article 259 has failed. The expanded scope of the new rule and increased documentation prevent us from making that inclusion. But the figures absolutely justify closer scrutiny. The FEI should publish a detailed breakdown showing how many cases involve the mouth, flanks, spurs, bits, or other equipment. It should disclose how many horses were allowed to continue, how many were ruled unfit, and how many warnings involved repeat offenders. Most importantly, the FEI should track whether the number of athlete-induced blood cases decreased over time. A successful welfare policy should not merely produce better records. It should reduce the number of horses experiencing the problem. If the warning rate begins to fall because riders become more careful, supporters of Article 259 will have evidence that the new system is changing behavior. If warnings remain high or continue increasing, the FEI will need to reconsider whether the consequences are strong enough. A warning system should never become a more acceptable way to document an unacceptable outcome. So, what do you think? Should athlete-induced blood in FEI show jumping result in immediate elimination, even when the lesion appears minor? Thank you so much for joining us. And remember, I am not AI. If you listen closely, you can hear me breathing.